The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the busy terminal. Staff Sergeant Maria Thompson stood in line at the check-in counter, her military uniform pressed and pristine despite the long journey from Afghanistan. Her shoulders carried the invisible weight of her third tour, but her chin remained high, a habit formed through years of service. The past 15 months had been a blur of desert heat, midnight missions, and video calls home to her family. Now, after 3 grueling tours, she was finally heading back to Charlotte, where her parents and younger sister waited with open arms. As she approached the counter, Maria pulled out her carefully saved first-class ticket, a small gift to herself, a tiny luxury after months of military cots and MREs. Getting home to someone special? The check-in agent asked warmly, noticing Maria's supple smile as she handed over her ID. "My whole family's waiting," Maria replied, her eyes lighting up. "My sister's making her famous sweet potato pie." The agent grinned, quickly processing her boarding pass. Walking through the terminal, Maria's boots clicked against the polished floor, a rhythm that felt strange after so many months of treading desert sand. She passed shops filled with overpriced snacks and last-minute souvenirs, breathing in the familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon that seemed to float from every other storefront. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another excited text from her sister. "Mom's already crying, and you're not even here yet." Maria chuckled, typing back a quick reply. Her family had been counting down the days, hours, and minutes until her return, just as she had. At the gate, Maria sat quietly, observing the usual airport scene unfold around her. A young mother tried to calm her fussy toddler while juggling a diaper bag. An elderly couple shared earbuds, both nodding along to what was probably their favorite song. A businessman frantically typed on his laptop, racing against some invisible deadline. The boarding call came over the speakers, and Maria gathered her carry-on. A standard-issue backpack containing everything she'd needed for the past few days of travel. As she stood in line, she overheard snippets of conversations, weekend plans, business meetings, family visits. Normal life. The kind of normal she'd been dreaming about during those long nights on base. Her first-class ticket had been a splurge, yes, but after 15 months of saving most of her combat pay, she figured she deserved this one comfort. The ticket had cost nearly a month's salary, but the thought of a comfortable seat, a hot meal, and a few hours of peace before the joyful chaos of her homecoming seemed worth every penny. As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, Maria thought about how far she'd come from that nervous 18-year-old who'd first enlisted. Now, at 28, she'd seen more of the world than she'd ever imagined, though not always its prettier parts. She'd led teams through situations she never could have prepared for, earned medals she'd never dreamed of, and grown into someone her younger self wouldn't recognize. The jet bridge stretched before her like a final pathway home. Maria adjusted her uniform one last time, a habit that had become second nature. Her combat boots, polished to a mirror shine that morning, carried her forward with purpose. In just a few hours, she'd be home, wrapped in the warm embrace of her family, surrounded by the love and comfort she'd been missing. Little did she know, this flight would become more than just the final leg of her journey home. As she approached the aircraft door, the bright Carolina sunshine already visible through the windows, Maria was about to step into a situation that would test her in ways very different from her military service and create ripples that would reach far beyond this single afternoon flight. As Maria stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of recycled air and coffee welcomed her. First class was to the left, a small luxury she'd dreamed about during those long nights on base. The cabin lights cast a warm glow over the plush leather seats, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the simple joy of this small comfort. "Seat 3A," she murmured to herself, making her way down the aisle. A few passengers smiled warmly as she passed, some nodding in acknowledgement of her uniform. One elderly gentleman, himself wearing a Korean War veteran's cap, gave her a respectful nod that spoke volumes about shared experiences. Just as Maria reached her assigned row, a flight attendant stepped into her path. The woman, whose name tag read Patricia, wore a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excuse me," Patricia said, her voice carrying a hint of doubt that made Maria's heart sink. "Could I see your boarding pass again?" Maria reached into her uniform pocket and retrieved the ticket, unfolding it carefully. She checked it 3 times before boarding, a habit from her military training. Always verify, always be certain. "Here you go," she said, keeping her voice steady and professional. Patricia examined the ticket with an intensity that seemed excessive, turning it over as if expecting to find something wrong. The seconds stretched uncomfortably. Other passengers were boarding now, the line backing up behind Maria. She could feel their eyes on her back, hear the shuffle of feet, and the murmur of confused voices. "There must be some mistake," Patricia finally said, her tone suggesting she'd found something worth questioning. "Economy class is to the right. Let me help you find your proper seat." The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. Maria felt her chest tighten, but years of military discipline kept her expression neutral. "Ma'am," she said calmly, "I purchased a first-class ticket. Seat 3A. I have my confirmation email as well, if you'd like to see it." A businessman in 2C looked up from his laptop, his forehead creasing with concern. An older woman in 3B, who would be Maria's seatmate, watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort, her hands nervously twisting the magazine in her lap. "Perhaps there's been a mix-up in the system," Patricia persisted, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Maria's skin prickle. "These things happen. Let me help you find a seat in economy where you'll be more comfortable." The suggestion's implication wasn't lost on anyone with inertia. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to be deeply absorbed in their phones or magazines. The silence in the cabin grew heavier with each passing moment. Maria took a deep breath, drawing on the same inner strength that had carried her through firefights and midnight missions. "I specifically saved for this seat," she explained, her voice clear but quiet. "I've just completed my 3rd tour, and I used my own money to purchase a first-class ticket home to my family." She pulled out her military ID, holding it alongside the boarding pass. The fluorescent cabin lights reflected off the laminated surface, highlighting her rank and credentials. "I understand you're doing your job, but I assure you, this is my assigned seat." The line behind her had grown longer, and Maria could hear the subtle sounds of discontent, the shuffle of feet, the clearing of throats, the soft murmurs of disapproval. Not at her, she realized, but at the situation itself. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8, tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Mom, why can't the soldier sit in her seat?" Patricia's smile remained fixed, but her eyes darted uncertainly between the ticket, Maria's uniform, and the growing line of passengers. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word from either side could turn this uncomfortable moment into something much worse. What neither Maria nor Patricia realized was that someone else was watching this scene unfold with keen interest. In seat 4D, just behind where this drama was playing out, sat a man who hadn't taken his eyes off the situation since it began. He wore a simple business suit and hadn't drawn attention to himself, but his attention was fully focused on every word and gesture of this interaction. The air in the cabin felt thick with tension, like the moments before a storm breaks. Maria stood her ground, her posture straight but not aggressive, her expression composed but determined. She'd faced worse situations than this, much worse, but something about this moment felt deeply personal, touching a nerve that combat never had. The man in seat 4D hadn't planned on becoming part of anyone's story that day. Robert Chen, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience, had been quietly conducting his quarterly flight reviews, something he'd done for 15 years at the airline. He preferred to travel unannounced, wearing his simple navy suit with no hint of his executive status, observing how their crew naturally treated passengers. He'd watched the entire scene unfold from his perfectly positioned seat, his trained eye catching every detail. The flight attendant's subtle change in demeanor when she saw Maria, the dismissive tone barely hidden behind professional words, the way other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. In his notepad, disguised as routine business notes, he'd been documenting everything. The cabin's tension reminded him of his own father's stories, tales of similar moments faced with quiet dignity decades ago. His father had owned a small grocery store, working 16-hour days to put Robert through college. "Always watch how people treat others when they think no one important is looking," his father used to say. Those words echoed in his mind now. Through the small gap between seats, he could see Maria's shoulders, straight and steady, her uniform crisp, despite what must have been a long journey home. The overhead lights caught the service medals on her chest, each one representing stories he could only imagine. His own son had served 2 tours in Iraq. He recognized the quiet strength in her stance. Around him, the other passengers were becoming restless. A businessman in 2A had set aside his laptop, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on his armrest. 2 flight attendants near the back were whispering, throwing concerned glances toward the scene. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, watched wide-eyed, learning something about the world he wouldn't soon forget. Robert noticed how Maria handled the situation. No raised voice, no harsh words, just steady resolve. It reminded him of a training video they'd created last year about dealing with difficult situations. Except this time, the wrong person was having to demonstrate professional restraint. He pulled out his phone, quietly typing a message to his assistant. Need immediate background on flight attendant Patricia Henderson, flight 2157 ATL to CLT. He knew every employee's file was just a few clicks away, but he wanted the full picture before he acted. His phone buzzed almost immediately. Patricia's file showed 15 years of service, generally positive reviews, but his eyes narrowed. 2 past incidents involving complaints about selective enforcement of seating policies. Nothing had been proven, but the pattern was becoming clear. The air conditioning hummed overhead, mixing with the low murmur of uncomfortable passengers. Robert watched a young woman in row 5 pull out her phone, likely documenting the scene. Social media would pick this up within hours if he didn't act. But this wasn't about PR. This was about something far more fundamental. He thought about his weekly executive meeting just yesterday, where they discussed their commitment to diversity and inclusion. Beautiful words in a boardroom were meaningless if they didn't match reality at 30,000 feet. His father's voice echoed again. The true test of principles isn't in making them, it's in living them when it costs you something. Through the gap in the seats, he could see Maria's hand resting on her boarding pass, her fingers steady despite the tension. The same hands that had probably handled weapons in combat zones were now having to defend her right to a seat she paid for. The irony wasn't lost on him. A flight attendant from economy class had wandered forward, perhaps sensing the growing tension. The boarding line had completely stalled now, with passengers in the jet bridge probably wondering about the delay. Robert could see the subtle signs of a situation about to spiral, the kind that would end up in training manuals as an example of what not to do. His company's core values were printed on a plaque in his office: respect, integrity, service, excellence. They weren't just words on a wall to him. They were promises to every person who stepped onto one of their planes. Right now, those promises were being broken in front of him. Robert took a deep breath and straightened his tie. He hadn't planned on revealing himself today, but sometimes leadership meant stepping up when you least expected to. As he prepared to stand, he realized this moment would likely become a different kind of training video, one about courage, both from a soldier standing her ground and from those willing to stand with her. Maria felt the weight of every eye in the cabin on her, but it wasn't the attention that bothered her. It was the familiar ache of having to prove she belonged somewhere. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest, fingers brushing against her service medals. Each one told a story of moments when she'd stood her ground under much worse circumstances. "I have everything in order," she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used to lead troops through sandstorms and midnight operations. "My boarding pass, my ID, and my payment confirmation." She pulled out her phone, bringing up the email that showed her first-class ticket purchase from 3 months ago. The flight attendant, Patricia, shifted uncomfortably, her rehearsed smile faltering slightly. "I'm just trying to avoid any confusion," she said, her voice carrying a hint of defensiveness. "Sometimes our system makes mistakes with seat assignments." A memory flashed through Maria's mind, her first day of basic training, when her drill sergeant had taught them about dignity under pressure. "Your uniform represents more than yourself," he'd said. "It represents everyone who's worn it before you and everyone who'll wear it after." The young girl who had spoken earlier was still watching, her small face a mix of confusion and concern. Maria caught her eye and gave her a gentle smile, remembering how her own niece looked up to her. That's why she couldn't just quietly accept being moved. This moment was about more than just a seat on a plane. "Ma'am," Maria began again, her tone professional but firm, "I spent the last 15 months serving our country. I saved specifically for this ticket, checked my assignment multiple times, and arrived early to ensure everything was in order. There's no confusion here. Only what appears to be an assumption about where I should or shouldn't sit." The cabin had grown so quiet that the hum of the aircraft's systems seemed loud in comparison. An older man across the aisle cleared his throat uncomfortably. The businessman who had been watching looked like he wanted to say something but wasn't quite sure what. Maria reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a small, worn photo, her family at her last deployment ceremony. "I'm heading home to these people," she said, her voice softening slightly. "They're waiting for me in Charlotte, and this first-class ticket was my small way of treating myself after being away from them for so long." The photo showed her parents, sister, and 2 young nieces, all beaming with pride. She'd looked at that photo every night during her deployment, finding strength in their smiles. Now somehow it felt right to share it, to remind everyone that she wasn't just a uniform in the wrong seat, but a person heading home to people she loved. A few rows back, someone muttered, "Let her sit down already." The comment seemed to break some of the tension, and several other passengers nodded in agreement. The line of people still waiting to board had grown longer, their faces a mix of curiosity and impatience. Patricia glanced nervously toward the back of the plane, perhaps hoping another flight attendant would come to her assistance. But Maria noticed something else, how some of the other crew members were deliberately staying away, their body language suggesting they didn't support their colleagues' actions. Drawing on years of military training in conflict resolution, Maria decided to offer a solution. "Why don't we check with the gate agent who scanned my boarding pass?" she suggested calmly. "They can verify that this is, indeed, my assigned seat. I'm happy to wait right here while you do that." The suggestion was reasonable, professional, and hard to refuse without appearing unreasonable. Maria knew this approach well. It was the same technique she'd used countless times in tense situations overseas. Give people a way to back down while saving face, her commanding officer had taught her. Behind her, more passengers had begun to whisper among themselves. She caught fragments of their conversations, words like ridiculous and shameful drifting through the cabin. A flight attendant from economy class had appeared at the back, watching the scene with visible concern. Maria stood straight, her posture perfect, not aggressive, but unmovable. The same stance that had carried her through firefights and peace talks now served her in this unexpectedly personal battle. Her fingers remained steady on her boarding pass, neither clenching nor trembling. She'd faced down bigger challenges than this, but somehow this one felt deeply personal in a way that combat never had. The gentle sound of a seatbelt unbuckling broke through the tense silence. Robert Chen rose from his seat in 4D, straightening his navy suit jacket with practiced ease. The movement drew every eye in the cabin, but he focused solely on the scene before him. His steps were measured and deliberate as he moved forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being heard. "I believe I can help resolve this situation." He reached into his interior jacket pocket and pulled out his airline executive ID badge, its gold emblem catching the cabin light. Patricia's eyes widened as she read his title, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience. The color drained from her face, and her practiced smile disappeared completely. The other passengers leaned forward slightly, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "I've been observing this interaction from the beginning," Robert continued, his tone professional but carrying an edge of disappointment. "Staff Sergeant Thompson has shown remarkable patience and professionalism while having her valid first-class ticket questioned repeatedly." The young girl who had been watching everything turned to her mother and whispered, "See, I told you the soldier was right." Her mother gently shushed her, but smiled encouragingly at Maria. Robert turned to address Patricia directly. "Could you explain to me why you felt it necessary to question Staff Sergeant Thompson's ticket multiple times, despite her providing all required documentation?" His question hung in the air, making the already quiet cabin seem even more silent. Patricia's hands nervously adjusted her name tag. "I was just following. I thought there might have been a system error." Her words trailed off as she realized how hollow they sounded. A system error, Robert repeated thoughtfully. Interesting. I've been reviewing our flights for the past 6 hours, and this is the only system error I've encountered. He glanced at his phone, where Patricia's employment record was still open. It's also interesting that this isn't the first time you've discovered such errors. The businessman in 2C had stopped pretending to work on his laptop. The elderly couple across the aisle exchanged knowing looks. Even the air conditioning seemed to hum more quietly, as if listening to what would happen next. Robert turned to Maria, his demeanor softening. Staff Sergeant, on behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for this completely unacceptable treatment. Your service to our country deserves our utmost respect, and your paid first-class ticket deserves to be honored without question. Maria maintained her professional composure, but her shoulders relaxed slightly, the first sign of tension she'd shown throughout the entire confrontation. Thank you, sir, she replied simply. A flight attendant from economy class had worked her way forward, watching the scene unfold. Robert gestured for her to join them. Lisa, could you please ensure Staff Sergeant Thompson is properly settled in her seat? And perhaps some complimentary refreshments once we're airborne. Lisa stepped forward eagerly, clearly relieved to help resolve the situation. Of course, sir. Right this way, Staff Sergeant. She gestured to seat 3A with a genuine smile. As Maria finally moved to take her rightful seat, several passengers broke into spontaneous applause. The young girl who had been watching everything beamed, while her mother wiped away what looked suspiciously like tears. Robert wasn't finished, though. He turned back to Patricia, his voice low but clear. We'll need to have a discussion about this incident. Please gather your belongings and exit the aircraft. Another flight attendant will take your place for this journey. Patricia's face flushed red, but she knew better than to argue. As she made her way toward the exit, the silence in the cabin was deafening. Every passenger watched as she walked past, some shaking their heads slightly. Robert remained standing for a moment, surveying the cabin. He could see phones being lowered, passengers who had been recording the incident, no doubt. This would probably end up on social media within hours. But for once, he wasn't worried about that. Some moments deserved to be shared, especially when they showed both the problems we still faced and the way they should be handled. He turned to address all the passengers, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay in our departure. I want to thank you for your patience, and particularly for those of you who showed concern for your fellow passenger. This is not what our airline stands for, and I assure you, this incident will lead to meaningful changes in our training and policies. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Lisa, the new flight attendant, moved through the cabin with natural grace, helping Maria settle into her seat while simultaneously coordinating with ground crew to find a replacement for Patricia. The other passengers watched with a mixture of satisfaction and lingering concern, the tension in the cabin slowly dissolving like morning mist. Would you like a bottle of water before takeoff, Staff Sergeant? Lisa asked, her genuine warmth a stark contrast to Patricia's earlier behavior. Maria accepted with a quiet thank you, her hands finally relaxing their grip on her carry-on bag. Robert Chen remained near the front of the cabin, making several quick phone calls. His voice was low but purposeful as he spoke to various department heads. Yes, I want a full investigation. No, this can't wait until Monday. I need HR to review all similar complaints from the past year. Yes, all of them. The young girl who had spoken up earlier was now excitedly telling her mother, that's how grown-ups should fix things. Her mother nodded, squeezing her daughter's hand with pride. It was a teaching moment that no classroom could have provided. Through the aircraft windows, passengers could see Patricia being escorted across the tarmac by ground crew. Some looked away, finding no pleasure in another person's downfall, while others watched with grim satisfaction. The airline's response had been swift and decisive. A clear message about their stance on discrimination. Lisa returned to Maria's seat with a comfort kit, the kind usually reserved for international first-class passengers. It's not much, she said softly, but we want you to have a comfortable flight home. The small gesture spoke volumes about how quickly word had spread among the crew about making things right. The businessman in 2C closed his laptop completely and turned to Maria. My son's in the Air Force, he shared. Thank you for your service, and thank you for standing your ground. Some battles need to be fought so others don't have to. More crew members appeared at the front of the plane, each one briefed on the situation. They moved through their pre-flight checks with extra attention to detail, their professionalism a silent apology for their former colleagues' behavior. Robert made one final call before returning to his seat. "I want this incident included in next week's training sessions," he instructed someone on the other end. "But remove names. This isn't about shaming one person, it's about learning from our mistakes." The replacement flight attendant arrived, slightly out of breath but ready to work. She had been briefed on the situation and made a point to stop at Maria's seat. "Welcome aboard, Staff Sergeant. We're honored to have you flying with us today." As the final preparations for takeoff began, passengers started sharing their own stories in hushed voices. An elderly woman spoke about her husband's military service decades ago. A college student mentioned her sister who was currently deployed. The incident had sparked conversations about respect, dignity, and standing up for what's right. The captain's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the delay, but not mentioning the specific incident, a professional courtesy to all involved. "We'll make up the time in the air," he assured everyone, his tone warm and confident. Lisa moved through the cabin one last time, checking seatbelts and tray tables. She paused briefly at Maria's seat. "If you need anything at all during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask. We want to make sure the rest of your journey home is perfect." Robert Chen watched all of this from his seat, making notes on his phone. This wasn't just about one incident anymore, it was about systemic change. He was already drafting points for Monday's executive meeting, enhanced training programs, clearer accountability measures, better reporting systems for incidents like this. As the aircraft began to push back from the gate, Maria took out her phone to turn it off. She had dozens of supportive messages from fellow passengers who had witnessed the incident, people sharing their contact information, offering to make formal statements if needed, expressing their support. The human spirit's capacity for solidarity was showing its better side. By the time Maria's flight landed in Charlotte, the video of the incident had already gone viral. Passengers from the flight had shared their recordings, each clip showing a different angle of the same story. A soldier standing quietly dignified in the face of discrimination, and a company leader stepping up to make things right. The young girl from the flight, whose simple question had helped highlight the absurdity of the situation, was interviewed by a local news station with her mother. "I didn't understand why anyone would be mean to a soldier," she said, her innocent words cutting straight to the heart of the matter. 3 days after the incident, Robert Chen sat in a packed conference room at the airline's headquarters. The screens behind him displayed screenshots from social media, employee feedback forms, and customer comments. "This isn't just about one flight," he explained to the assembled executives. "This is about who we are as a company and what we stand for." The airline's response was swift and comprehensive. They launched a new training program, developed with input from diversity experts and veterans organizations. Flight crews began receiving enhanced cultural sensitivity training with Maria's incident, names changed, serving as a powerful case study. But the impact spread beyond just one airline. Other carriers began reviewing their own policies and training procedures. The Industry Trade Association invited Robert to speak about the incident and the changes it inspired. "Sometimes it takes one moment to reveal where we need to improve," he told the packed auditorium. "The real test is what we do with that knowledge." Maria's story became a catalyst for change, but she hadn't set out to be a symbol. She was invited to speak at various events, sharing her experience with calm professionalism. "I just wanted to go home," she would say, "but sometimes life puts you in a position where you have to stand up for what's right." The airline created a new customer service award recognizing employees who went above and beyond in making all passengers feel welcome. Lisa, the flight attendant who had stepped in to help, was its first recipient. Her genuine kindness that day had shown how simple acts of human decency could help heal difficult situations. 6 months after the incident, Maria received an invitation to the airline's annual leadership conference. She sat in the audience, still in her military uniform, as Robert Chen unveiled the company's new core values statement. The words dignity, respect, and inclusion were prominently featured, not just as abstract concepts, but as principles backed by concrete policies and actions. The young girl who had spoken up on the flight stayed in touch with Maria through her mother. She started a school project about military service and respect, inspiring her classmates to write thank you letters to deployed service members. Small ripples creating bigger waves of change. 1 year later, a survey showed a significant decrease in discrimination complaints across all major airlines. Maria's story had become part of flight attendant training programs industry-wide. It's not just about following rules, trainers would explain. It's about treating every person with the respect they deserve. Robert Chen kept the handwritten note Maria had sent him after the incident pinned to his office wall. "Thank you for showing that one person can make a difference," it read. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on military battlefields. The airline's customer service ratings improved steadily over the following months. Passengers reported feeling more valued, more respected, more human. The incident had reminded everyone that behind every ticket, every seat number, and every uniform was a person with their own story. Maria continued her military service, but her impact on civilian life remained. She occasionally received messages from people who had seen the video or heard her story, sharing their own experiences of standing up against discrimination. Each message reminded her that sometimes the quietest acts of courage could spark the loudest changes. The story became part of a larger conversation about respect, dignity, and the importance of speaking up. In break rooms and boardrooms, in classrooms and living rooms, people discussed not just what had happened that day, but what it meant for all of us, how one moment of standing firm for what's right could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond that single flight.